So where we conclude at the end of chapter 4 is Jesus is surrounded by a crowd. Drawn for a good reason. He's doing incredible things, miraculous things. People are being healed of all kinds of things we read in verse 24. Various diseases, pains, demon possession, epilepsy, being paralyzed, and everybody's being healed. So word spreads in that whole area, and so they're all just packing in. And then the way chapter 5 starts, some of us might have a Bible where the words of Jesus is in red. Well, beginning in verse 3, we're about to have 3 chapters of solid red. Here comes this most famous sermon or lesson that Jesus delivers, and it's the blueprint for the kingdom, or it's the DNA for those who would follow him. It's the characteristics of what it means to be a Christian. And so we will spend a lifetime exploring all the depth of what all of these things mean. But what we notice is when the crowd gathers, so in chapter 5, verse 1, he sees the crowds. So he went up on the mountains, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and then he opened his mouth and began to teach them. Now, generally in our society, when we're teaching in a learning environment, generally the teachers stand and the students sit. But in Jesus' day, it was the reverse. The teachers sat, and then the students would stand around. And Jesus is on kind of an upslope, so you have sort of a natural theater effect where people can see him, people can hear him. And if you've ever had a speech class, one of the most challenging parts of any message is what's called the introduction, where you introduce what you're going to talk about. Because couldn't you just talk about what you're going to talk about? But the introduction is because before you start speaking, people's thoughts are wherever they are. It sure is hot today, or I'm hungry, or I wished I'd have had the fish instead of the beef, or whatever it is. How do you get people focused on what it is that you're about to say? So the introduction in a speech class is about gathering people's attention and focusing them on the message that you want to deliver. Well, Jesus comes out with an interesting introduction. We call them the Beatitudes, or one of my friends says the attitudes to be, or to have. But you get in verse 3 down through verse 10 these sort of rapid-fire statements. And you and I have the luxury to stop and to consider and ponder them, because they're like anything in the Word of God. There's just layers of depth here. But this first crowd is just getting it as it goes by, so they can imagine trying to catch up. So the first thing Jesus does is he says, blessed, which that's a chocolate word. I mean, when you say that word, sign me up. Whatever it is, blessed, man, I want to be blessed. Whatever the category, I want to be blessed financially. I want to be blessed in health. I want to be blessed relationally. I like this word. It's a word that describes being enriched or contented or filled or satisfied. Powerful word. But what he does is put together an odd opposite, not what I was expecting. Because when you say blessed, I'm like, sign me up. Blessed are the poor in spirit. So he uses this opposite concept, because now when you use the word poor, unsign me up. I don't like that word, because I don't want to have poor finances. I don't want to have poor health. I don't even want to have a poor attitude. I just don't, because the word means the opposite of filled. It means empty. It means bereft. It means lacking. And so, blessed are the poor in spirit, he says, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So he's already introduced kingdom of heaven is on its way. It's right around the corner. It's at hand. But now he says the way you're going to be full, the way you're going to be content, the way you're going to be satisfied is if you have this sense of emptiness in spirit. Again, we have the luxury to sift this and soak in this. But it seems to be describing some sort of openness, some sort of humility, some sort of readiness to the Spirit's leading. We saw in the previous chapter that even after he's told that he's a blessed son, a loved son, that the Spirit leads him into the wilderness. So the wilderness is another one of those poor kind of places. It's empty, it's open, it's not sure they like that. So Jesus combines this. He does it again in verse 4. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Well, mourn is a word that means you're experiencing painful loss. Well, I'm not interested in that. How can you be filled if you've had loss? However, there's this promise, this assurance, but you'll be comforted. Well, I like that part. I like being comforted. And then he says, blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. Another odd statement. One of the older translations says meek, and as I was growing up, when I heard meek, my mind associated it with weak. But the word gentle is a good word because it's a word that describes strength restrained or power that's been properly focused. In other words, we use this English word gentle. We say someone's a gentleman. Well, what does that mean? Well, they use their ability to open the door for someone or throw their coat over a rain puddle or hold an umbrella, that you're using your strength or abilities or assets to help someone. That gentleness is a way of taking care of someone. I always think about the example that a lot of fathers, when their boys are little, will wrestle with them on the floor. And if you take the average father, maybe he's 200 pounds, he's pretty strong, he's in the prime of life, and his 3-year-old son, 2-year-old son jumps off the end of the couch on him. In that wrestling match, who wins that one? Well, obviously the dad does. In fact, how hard would it be for the dad to injure the boy? Not real hard. But dads wrestle with their sons, which means they jump and roll around and carry on. So here's this father in the prime of his life, of adulthood, measuring his strength for the appropriate response. So he catches the boy, cradles the boy, kind of play pushes him or mediates his speed and strength so that no one gets hurt. So being gentle is about this restraining or mediating so that you have the proper response. Some places the Bible says to give a gentle response to others, which means that doesn't mean you have to say what you think, or you don't have to be harsh, or you don't have to be aggressive. You can pause, consider, and deliver the appropriate response. But still, you mean they're going to inherit the earth? Because isn't it nice guys finish last? Isn't it's a dog eat dog world? How does this really happen? How does this become true? So here's these odd opposites that don't mesh right, you would think. Now in verse 6, he gives us another set, or triplets, if you will, that shift a little bit. Rather than just sort of strange opposites, you get blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. So again, I don't associate blessed, full, content, satisfied with hungry and thirsty. But I do like, but they're going to be satisfied. I like the way that ends up. That sounds full. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. There's some of this, you're going to receive what you give. There's some sort of relationship here. But then you get to verse 8. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. So all you have to do to see God is just be pure in heart. Well, I guess we'll never see it, right? Because pure, oh boy, I mean, it's too late to be perfect. How many of us are pure? This is a fun word because it can mean the idea of pure in the sense of without flaw. It can mean pure in the sense of unmixed. It can mean pure in the sense of not lacking anything. It has a similar ring as blessed. Well, how do we get from here to there? Well, in fact, if you just read ahead real quick to the end of the chapter, he says in verse 48, therefore, you are to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Can you imagine the really original audience just going, okay, I guess it's too late for me. But where there's this desire for purity, it results in a kind of relationship with God where there's an intimacy to the level that you could see Him, or that there's this sort of closeness. To give you kind of a heads up, this is going to be something that's given to us as a gift. So it's not about personal performance, but rather it's about the work that God is going to do. But that comes in a little bit later. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. So one of the inherent characteristics of being a son of God or a child of God is a willingness and an ability to make peace, rather than being divisive or rather than driving people apart. Rather, it's about healing relationships. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Persecution is about suffering because you're trying to do what's right, and yet that's a path that he's going to talk about quite a bit. In fact, in verse 11, he sort of pulls this together by saying, blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Now, if we can be honest for a second, if you're being lied about, insulted, persecuted, are you feeling full and content and satisfied? Yeah, me neither. So what is he talking about? You might consider 2 Corinthians chapter 12, reading that part where Paul talks about the thorn in his flesh and about what he learns about how God's grace works in his struggle. But as Jesus is laying the groundwork, talking about the DNA, the characteristic, the nature of the kingdom, he's already saying that there's something different here, because being content and filled when we're insulted and harmed, he gives us a response in verse 12 by saying rejoice, which means to express joy. I'm going to go ahead and say I don't think he's suggesting that it's manufactured or that it's faked. So in order to express joy, it's got to be coming from somewhere. Rejoice and be glad. Why? How? Well, he says a couple things. Number one, he says, for your reward in heaven is great. I think one of the cruel things that Satan does to us is he tries to convince us that our present is our future. He tries to convince us that we're stuck or that we're frozen because we become hopeless. We don't have any hope because we no longer have a positive expectation about the future, which is one way of defining hope. When you lose that, it's never going to change. It's always going to be this way. It'll never get better. There goes your expectation of the future. So now your present becomes your future. And Satan tends to have us in a full clinch hold when he finally gets us to believe that our past is now our present and our future. That we are truly paralyzed at that point. So whatever mistakes, whatever bad things happened, whatever that is, that's now us. It defines us. That's all we're ever going to be. That's who we are because that was then, this is now, and will ever be. And that's just a miserable place to live. So what Jesus does is say that, first of all, look over the horizon. All this might be right here, but your reward in heaven is great. There was a young man years ago that had a bone disorder where his bones were real brittle, and he was, by the age of 17, had already had over 100 surgeries of different, he could just barely trip, even sneeze and crack ribs, and it's just, so much suffering. And they asked him, they said, do you ever get mad at God? And his response was this. He said, well, I don't know why God has chosen this for me, but he has all of eternity to make it up to me. That's a long-term view. Instead of focusing right here on the problem, it's look on down the road. There's something else coming. He says your reward in heaven is great, a beautiful way to say whatever it is that goes on right now, it's going to be worth it. The second thing he addresses, because Satan likes to say this is it, that's all that'll ever be, and steal our hope. When he steals our hope, he steals our joy. The second thing he likes to do is isolate us. You're all by yourself. No one understands your troubles. No one really cares. When he gets us off in this, as one of my friends says, swimming laps in the pity pool, when we were just focused on our own problems, then we're not getting anyone to encourage us, support us, or remind us of, no, this is not all there is. He says it this way, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So this is not new. You're not by yourself. Everything's going to be okay because God's in control. So the two things that Satan likes to do is steal our hope and convince us that we're alone or that we're isolated. Jesus gives us two things to do. Look over the horizon, spend some time gazing at heaven. Sometimes we spend more time researching a vacation than we do our eternal home. Just look down the road at where we're headed. And number two, look beside you, because you're not on this road by yourself. You've got folks in the past, brothers and sisters of faith in the past we learn about in Scriptures and in our own family and church family histories, and in the people who are with us. Because when that starts to happen, when these Beatitudes start to become a part of us, when our DNA begins to realign to this new creation, then it brings about a change. And he uses two word pictures. He says in verse 13 that you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. That's kind of at least for me, that's sort of an odd analogy, because I'm so used to be careful, don't use too much salt. You know how sodium is. And so salt for me is almost a negative image. But in Jesus' day, I think one of the fascinating things about history is that we have only had refrigeration in a widespread sense in, the last 75 years or so. which means prior to just recent history, all of mankind in every culture has had the same problem. How do you preserve meat? How do you keep food? Well, you could dry meat and you could salt meat. Salt was used as a powerful preservative. Salt was also a powerful medicinal use. They would use it on wounds and all that as a disinfectant to help sanitize. And of course, salt makes food better. I don't know how that works. If you just take a mouthful of salt, it's terrible. But you put a little bit of it in your food, I don't know how, somehow it enhances or amplifies taste. Well, salt was so valuable in Jesus' day that it wasn't unusual for Roman soldiers out on the frontier to actually be paid in salt. But there is also one other part about this that's strange when Jesus says, well, if salt's not salty, what do you do with it? I've never experienced that. And if you pull out your salt shaker, Morton salt, or whatever, and you look on the back, it's something like 99.8% pure. It's been bleached, it's been processed, and so it's a real pure thing. But salt is an aggressive chemical compound. That's why it corrodes metals if you put it around other things, because it has a very aggressive nature. So it likes to grab things and combine with things, which is what rust or corrosion is. But if you could imagine going out to, let's say the coast, an ocean coast, and you know how the water washes up on rocks and recedes and the sun dries it at high tide and low tide. So you get along a shoreline, you'll sort of see a kind of a whitish crust on those rocks. Well, because there's salt in the water and the water evaporates and leaves behind the solids, you could go out there and chip off some of that crust and it would be salty. Now, if you've ever been to the coast, it would be other things too. There'd be a lot of biological material there, we'll just say it that way. So it would be very impure, and the reason why that matters is you could grab that up and it could be salty, but it could, in your sack or in your cabinet, it could sit there and recombine with the other things mixed in it and then become unsalty. It's become something else. Well, Jesus' point is, so if you have salt and it's not salty, what do you use it for? I don't know. It becomes sand at that point. It does not have the chemical component or value of salt, so you just throw it out. Well, he says we're supposed to be like this. Well, if Christ begins to bring the healing, if we allow him to bring the changes in us, because remember, salt is powerful. It enhances flavor. It can be a healing agent. It can be a preservative agent. Those are all ideas about what Jesus has come to do. Remember the first chapter, the angel said, you'll name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. And we become agents of that, where we are truly changed. But now, if the change is not authentic, well, then what good is it? What's the point in going to church if it doesn't make a difference in our lives? Similarly, he uses in verse 14 the image of your light of the world, where the salt seems to be unique and powerful because of its characteristic or its nature. Here, the city on the hill is something that's obvious, something that's not camouflaged. He said, a city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. One of the characteristics, if we're going to rejoice and be glad when people are insulting us and persecuting us, that's just weird. I mean, that's different. What is that? It's the kind of difference that draws people to salvation, because how do you have peace? How do you have joy with all this yuck going on? You're in the wilderness over here, but you're not acting like it. So how can you be filled in a place that's empty? That's fascinating. It sticks out like light, but also draws people to their life being enhanced or preserved or cleansed. Those two ideas combined. So he tells us in verse 16, let your light shine before men in such a way they may see your good works. So it's not about hiding who we are or what we're doing, but importantly, he says, and that they glorify your Father who is in heaven. So it's not about being hidden, but neither is it about being self-seeking or arrogant. So the light is not about us, but about God. In other words, if we do experience healing and differences in our lives, it doesn't help to say it's because I'm amazing, but it helps a lot to say it's because God's amazing. Because I can't change anybody's life. I can't heal anyone, but I know who can. And so as he finishes this chapter, he talks about the difference, about how He's not coming to abolish the law and the prophets, which is everything left of Matthew, the Old Testament, the Old Covenant. He's not going to destroy it. He's going to complete it or fulfill it. And so we still carry our Bibles, as 1 Corinthians 10 teaches us, as an example, and we learn. In fact, the New Testament assumes we know the Old Testament. But it's been fulfilled or completed, so it becomes a reference, but it's not our guide. It's not our law. So he says, I'm going to come and complete all of that, even every little letter. And if you follow Jesus, then that's a smooth transition from the Old Covenant to the New. If you try to follow Jesus and you reject the law and you don't keep the Passover, it's a unique time. Those people following Jesus, remember he said the kingdom of heaven is at hand? So the king's there, but he hasn't established his kingdom yet, which is a unique 3-year period, if you will, in all of eternity. But as he wraps up this piece, he launches this huge statement in verse 20. For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Can you even imagine the original crowd, just their hair being blown back? Because the scribes and Pharisees were like the religious experts, the spiritual giants. And Jesus says, if you can't be more righteous than them, then there's not even a start. Can you imagine them just thinking, well, but see, the big question is, well, what is righteousness? And how do you get better at it? Well, and that's the part that begins in the next lesson as he takes the second half, beginning in verse 21.